Hello and happy Halloween. Welcome to the Q&A for the latest issue of the Rule Investment Newsletter with me, Paul Harris, and of course with Rick Rule. Hello, Rick. Good afternoon.
Hello, Paul. Pleasure to be with you. Great issue. Lots and lots of excitement around it. So I think we're going to have a good session.
I think so too, and it's perhaps appropriate that we're recording this or putting this out on Halloween because there's perhaps a lot to avoid as well as a lot to be attracted to in the critical mineral space. Issue 8 was about critical minerals with a focus on defense applications. The next issue will look at critical minerals with energy applications. That's going to come out towards the end of November, and hopefully we'll do the Q&A in late November for that. This is a Q&A. So please submit any questions you have using the Q&A tool. As a reminder, you can subscribe to the newsletter via Substack at realrickrule.substack.com. Okay, to kick this off, first a caveat. The factors affecting the critical minerals investment are changing rapidly. This, perhaps more than any other mineral sector, is one where you have to do your due diligence to understand what the investment proposition is of any stock, particularly as there are many ghouls and goblin companies jumping on the bandwagon. And other factors that continually or make it a very volatile or interesting environment are the number of announcements, the political announcements coming out of the White House, coming out of China, coming out of the European Union. There's a lot in the mix, a lot to keep ahead of and abreast of. Critical minerals and strategic vulnerability of supply chains have dominated news headlines for much of this year and going back into last year because of the growing realization that China has a dominant production and refining position in many metals and minerals. This is not a new scenario, one that has been building for the past 30 or 40 years as China developed excess low-cost production capacity, which Western producers have struggled to compete with. And it has become an issue due to the dawning realization that many of the minerals in which China is the dominant producer and processor of are essential ingredients in many weapons and energy systems, and of course, industrial capability. More recently, it has come to a head because the US has a president in Donald Trump, whose world vision is one of competing power blocks and not cooperating power blocks. In this view, a lack of critical minerals in friendly hands is a strategic and military vulnerability. In terms of actual weapons, access to critical minerals is one factor that determines who has the best and most effective weapon systems. Put bluntly, if China's got tungsten on the tips of its missiles and the US hasn't, China will likely outshoot or could likely outshoot the US. or Russia, or whoever the potential opponent is. Western governments are seeking to address this minerals imbalance, although there's only so much that can be done given the extent of the geological imbalance of where resources are distributed around the world. There are critical minerals deposits in the Western world, but the key issue is addressing the economic imbalance. As mentioned earlier, Western producers could not and cannot compete with cheap Chinese materials on a sort of commercial basis. The pricing of most of the minerals that we're concerned with is established by Chinese production, which Western producers struggle to meet and which Western consumers, importantly, don't necessarily want to give up. Western governments have several tools at their disposal that can help level the playing field by reducing the cost of capital through grants and loans, and perhaps by providing offtake contracts and even price flooring. The news stream is increasingly full of news of US government funding initiatives of these kind. On August the 13th, President Trump announced $1 billion in financing for critical minerals projects, which followed his One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which allocated $7.5 billion for critical minerals. For example, US agencies from the Department of War, the Department of Energy, the US Export-Import Bank, and the US International Development Finance Corporation are deploying funding. And because of this, some of the largest financial institutions are starting to get on board, such as JP Morgan Chase, which launched a 1.5 trillion security and resiliency initiative to boost critical industries, including, of course, critical minerals. A key point to understand here is that it is not necessarily the raw materials per se that are required, but the processed minerals that are the inputs into the energy systems, into the weapon systems, into the industrial military complex. China dominates the processing in many mineral processing categories, and that is the strategic bottleneck that governments such as the US government and the European Union wish to address. For example, there is little point in the US government funding a company to dig up rare earths or lithium or graphite or tungsten or antimony, for that matter, if that material then has to be shipped to China to be processed into the materials that can then be made into things. The US government is very much looking to develop local processing supply chains and is prepared to advance funding to stimulate and encourage this. When reviewing investment opportunities, you need to understand where in the supply chain that opportunity lies and what parts of the supply chain it is seeking to service. Many companies are jumping on the bandwagon with a strategy that seems to look no further than getting money from the US government. We're seeing a number of juniors finding rock samples on their properties with rare earths or antimony, with this or with that, right at the start of the supply chain. This is not the place that the part of the supply chain that the US government is really focusing on. Many of the critical minerals are relatively low volume markets, which means a new source of supply can disrupt the supply-demand balance, which obviously will be negative for pricing. Critical minerals deposits produce a range of grades, which will all need to find a home or specific markets. Many of the very high-end military use markets are tiny, tiny, tiny by volume, and the revenue they will generate will unlikely be able to sustain a complete mining operation, which has a lot of lower grade material that it needs to place into the market. A critical mineral company has to actively develop a wide client base across a diverse cross-section of markets. So that's one question you need to ask. Does your investment idea have the ability to do this? For example, while the US military may pay over the odds to get that very small fraction of high grade from a domestic source of antimony, for example, will the US flame retardant producers be willing to do the same? Or will they be more content buying the low cost material coming out of China? In this issue, we looked at rare earth elements, antimony, tungsten, and tin. These all have multiple unique markets and different competitive factors that all require close attention. A caveat here again, investing in the critical mineral space requires a lot of work because there's so many different factors, the government factors, the international commerce factors, and of course the broad market factors. It's a very different proposition from investing in gold or silver companies where those products typically have a very obvious and ready market. There is a lot of noise in this sector, and the task is to identify the companies that perhaps will become or have a chance of becoming US supply chain champions. I'll now sort of give a few sort of general comments about those four mineral groups that I just mentioned. They're all very different. They have some similarities, but they have a lot of differences too. Rare earth elements, they're used to make the magnets that are essential to advanced military technologies, including precision-guided missiles, radar systems, and fighter jets. The most critical rare earth elements for these applications are some of the light rare earth elements, neodymium and praseodymium, and the heavy rare earth elements, dysprosium and terbium. Now, why is this important? It's important because there are 15 to 17 rare earth elements, depending on which way you count them, and they usually all occur in a deposit together. Most of the rare earth elements in a deposit will be light rare earth elements. And mines are usually geared to optimize the production of the NdPr, the neodymium, praseodymium ones, which is the sort of main market there. They typically represent or account for 16 to 23% of the total rare earth oxide of the world's main mines. That means that if the main product out of a rare earth deposit is only 16 to 23% of that deposit, the producer has got to find markets for another 70 or 80% of the stuff it's digging up out of the ground to be profitable and to be economic. To produce the heavy rare earth elements, such as dysprosium and terbium, companies also have to produce the light rare earth elements. An issue with increasing heavy rare earth output is that it will result in the production of many more or much greater volume of light rare earth elements, which will again potentially flood markets and destroy pricing and threaten the economic sustainability of any given company. This is particularly true as the major rare earth mines exploit carbon, which have very low concentrations of the heavy rare earth elements. Better deposits for these perhaps are the iconic clay deposits, which see natural weathering processes enrich and concentrate the heavy rare earth elements, and consequently they can deliver substantially more heavy rare earths per unit of NdPr than a carbonatate deposit. So a first question to ask is, what kind of deposit is my company of interest looking to exploit? Processing is key here, and this is what the US government funding really aims to stimulate. China dominates rare earth processing and the technology. The government, the US government, the European Union want to stimulate this. In the US, we've seen this in action with the US government funding deals with MP Materials, directly investing in the company at the corporate level and its Mountain Pass project at the asset level. And more recently with funding announcements for Aclara Resources. Both these companies are looking to mine rare earth elements, but also develop downstream supply chains or processing of those. Aclara recently announced that it's going to build its rare earth separation plant in Louisiana. Moving to tungsten. Tungsten is a hardening agent which is used on the tips of missiles and other munitions to give penetration, as well as in armor to give penetration resistance. It has a plethora of other industrial applications, including light bulb filaments, and as a nanofilament that makes the chips that power artificial intelligence possible. In 2024, 81% of the world's tungsten was produced by China, which in February this year announced it would cease exporting it, sending prices to all-time highs. Now, the US formerly produced tungsten, but it has not been mined in the US since 2025. And now the Department of War, because of the growing trade war spat or geopolitical dispute between China and the US, now the Department of War is barred from using tungsten that comes from China, Russia, or North Korea from 2027. Now, this is perhaps strategically short-sighted, but I suppose the aim there is to really kickstart the development of a US tungsten supply chain. There are a handful of companies in mining-friendly Nevada and Canada with tungsten exploration and development projects that are also looking to restart former mines. There are also some US processing options available through companies such as Global Tungsten and Powders. However, tungsten is a difficult material for processing. Remember, China's got the specialist knowledge of how to do this. It doesn't necessarily exist to a great extent in the West. The processing challenge is that tungsten is both very tough, but it's also very fragile. So it's quite easy to turn your tungsten material into unusable dust if you mess up the processing. Antimony, as with other critical minerals, antimony's biggest markets by volume are relatively mundane, with antimony oxide mainly used as a flame retardant in plastic fabrics and other materials. A niche market at about 8% is the use of antimony in munitions and defense applications. Again, you see the high-end use is a very small part of the market, which means any antimony producer has to find markets for the majority of its material, which are in more mundane basic industries, where given the small volumes, the entrance of new supply can rapidly destroy pricing. Antimony is quite unique as well because it is mainly produced as a byproduct with other metals such as gold. It's a little bit like silver in this context. This makes it difficult to invest in per se because there are very few antimony companies that just look to produce and develop antimony assets. Exposure typically comes by investing in a gold company such as Perpetual Resources, which a couple of weeks ago broke ground on its stibnite project in Idaho. It's going to produce several 100,000 ounces a year of gold and several tens of thousands, or sorry, several million pounds, tens of millions of pounds of antimony as a byproduct. Overall, the market is relatively small at about 72,000 tons per year. Now, the thing to watch out for here, there's a handful of US gold projects that have an antimony byproduct. Now, if all these companies bring their antimony to market, that could, they're all claiming that they can supply a significant part of US demand. But if they all come to market, they could potentially flood the market and destroy pricing. So this is something to be very, very cognizant of when looking at these opportunities. Stibnite, I think, is looking to, says it can supply about 40% of US demand. 2 or 3 of those, and the market's oversupplied. Moving to tin. Tin is mainly used for soldering circuit boards, and its demand is forecast to increase with the growth of general economic growth, but also of artificial intelligence, data centers, semiconductors, solar energy, etc., etc. Tin is a vital element or component in electronics, electric vehicles, advanced robotics, and many other electronic and digital applications. Serves a very simple purpose, but it's an essential purpose, and there really isn't a substitute for it. With historical demand growth of 2 to 3% per annum and few supply sources, supply is unlikely to keep up with demand, and prices are set to increase. China doesn't dominate tin production to the same extent as it does with other critical minerals. However, it supplied about 86% of US imports of tin lead solder in 2024. It doesn't dominate production of the raw material, but it dominates the production of the key thing it is turned into that everybody needs. Okay, that's my sort of brief overview on this particular minerals. Rick, let me bring you in and get some sort of comments and opinions from you about how you look at the critical mineral space. There's so much going on. There's so many potential traps, value traps, etc. How do you navigate this?
Well, I think, first of all, that was a wonderful overview, and I hope that everybody who's listening has access to a recording so they can listen to it again. That's a lot of material, and it represents an awful lot of work. It is important to understand the fundamentals of these industries before you pay too much attention to the narratives that will be coming to you online and from the investment banks. So I urge everybody who just sat through that presentation to listen to it again so that they get to begin to really understand the markets that these narratives are woven around. And I would say at the beginning, beware narrative. What Paul is talking about today was as true 18 months ago when nobody cared about critical minerals or rare earths as it is today. The difference is that the stocks were half as expensive. So it's important that you put all of this into context. What's happening is that the narrative in the market, or pardon me, the pricing, is beginning to justify a narrative that's been around for a long time. It makes perfect sense if we didn't understand it then and don't understand it now, that the first step is to get an understanding, which is really what the letter was all about. A few companies, pardon me, a few comments on Paul's comments. At the beginning, he talked about an increasing involvement by the US government in markets, both good and bad. I personally, as a taxpayer, have no interest in being in Mr. Trump being a money manager for me, particularly managing money that he extracted from me via tax. So, from a taxpayer's point of view, I'm discouraged by all of this. From an investor's point of view, what Mr. Trump is doing is lowering my cost of capital, which is extremely attractive to me. So I have two different viewpoints on that. Regardless of my viewpoint, Mr. Trump's view of the world with competing trade blocs increasingly rather than cooperating trade blocs is, I think, true. And I think the stratification of trading blocs around the world into a Chinese bloc and a separate East Asian bloc, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, either acting collectively or separately, North America, the European zone, and perhaps the Middle East too, is a reality. Part of that reality will have to do with the fact that with each of those trade blocs competing to secure supply, competing at a government level, that the reality is that the cost of capital for operators who can service those respective blocks is going to go lower as a consequence of overt or covert government subsidies. That's an important thing. What I want to stress more, though, is the fact that as compelling as this sector may be, the regular investment constraints, the regular investment considerations uh, need to be paramount in what you do. Meaning, as an example, what Paul talks about in terms of concentrated markets. Great big markets like copper or oil or even gold are safer than these tiny markets. So understand that if you are in a very small market where you add supply, uh, you're going to have some difficulties. Understand that these will be extremely volatile markets. And as a consequence of that, high risk. High risk can also be high reward. I'm not saying avoid them. All I'm trying to say is understand what Paul just said based on the reality of the markets that you're proposing to address. I also want to say in the middle of the narrative that management expertise is important. There will be doubtless all kinds of newly minted antimony and tungsten and rare earth companies that are headed by amalgams of butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, people who can't pronounce all of the rare earths that Paul just pronounced. The probability that this coalition of butchers and bakers and candlestick makers will ultimately be more successful than teams who have already operated in these spaces for 10 years is nil. When you are considering smaller companies, non-producing companies, it really truly is all about the team. So focus on the expertise that the team has, not their narrative. Tungsten in Nevada sounds good until you hear that the promoter of the Tungsten in Nevada company, until very recently, was employed selling used cars and not in Nevada. And go back to the lessons that you learned in the rural classroom about what makes a good investment or a good speculation, irrespective of the narrative headline. Scale matters. The mining business is a high risk business, as is the processing business. A big mine or a big plant has the same risks as a small mine or a small plant, but a big operation can make you big money, while a small operation can never make you big money. There is a compelling narrative around mining, particularly processing, that you start with a modest sum of money, you generate free cash, you use the free cash to grow, and you don't have to dilute. Wonderfully, wonderfully, wonderfully convincing narrative. And in my experience, almost always wrong. The range of talents involved in starting something and then running something and then growing something are often very different. And most small companies don't have access to enough capital to support the G&A to develop into a full cycle producer. Please understand that. So scale is important. For me, the minimum acceptable scale in a resource company is a target of circa $3 billion US in situ recoverable reserves and resources. Uh, Much smaller than that, and I just sort of don't care. A success won't matter to anybody, myself included. My preference is, of course, tier one deposits, which I define as in situ recoverable reserves at today's reserves and resources at today's commodity prices that exceed $10 billion. So I'm interested in big deposits, irrespective of the name of the commodity that they produce. I'm also interested in old-fashioned competitive deposits. I would like to see the projected all-in sustaining costs of a project be in the lowest cost quartile worldwide. Um, Narrative doesn't matter if you don't make money. I would also like to see these companies be competitive in terms of return on investment. I'd like to see the companies have deposits, at least with a valid target, that would generate returns on investment or internal rates of return that are in the best quartile in the industry. This is going to be difficult because we don't know what the industry's return on capital targets are, although they're starting to be investment bankers' ROI targets published in a variety of these things. I like to see for non-producing companies, which is the advanced explorers, developers, things like that. I like to see indicated returns on investment in the range of 25% unleveraged. The idea being that you could then employ, in the right circumstance, 50% leverage and generate 22 to 25%. Pardon me, substantially higher, 30% return on equity. So I think that's important. I think in reviewing this whole topic, that you need to understand in the first instance that the landscape has changed for the entire industry, for better or for worse. Countries are interested in access to supplies of these critical materials. The world is, for better or for worse, forming into trading blocks. One consequence of these trading blocks is that they will compete with each other financially for access to supplies, both processing supplies and raw material supplies, which should lower the company's cost of capital. Cost of capital and understanding the cost of capital will be an important part of your ability to pick the winners from the losers. So, in addition to understanding something about the deposit, or in the case of the processors, something about the process and technology, you will need to begin to analyze their cost of capital, including how much and at what cost comes from offtake partners and or governments. And remember, scale matters, cost matter, return on capital employees matters. And before you consider all that, let me tell you one more time, expertise matters. Somebody, as an example, who is in the rare earth space, who until 2 or 3 years ago was in some other space, is unlikely to have the depth of experience to outcompete other people who have broader industry experience. So, with all of those caveats, Paul, I'm extremely excited about this space. I am and have been for a very long time. As an example, a shareholder of AlphaMin. Uh, how does this fit into the equation? Being in Congo, part of no particular trading block. Well, I would argue that it's the largest, highest grade, most profitable tin deposit in the world, and likely to attract European suitors, Chinese suitors, and American suitors. They will likely be able to pick what their partners look like. That's constrained by virtue of the fact that whoever is the loser may be able to incite local opposition in Eastern Congo that is, in this case, violent. Interesting circumstance. I'm, as you know, a holder of several rare earth names and have been for a fairly substantial period of time. And a further comment here, rare earths aren't rare. They are 4 to 5 times more abundant in the Earth's crust than gold, as an example. Uh, we haven't found them because we haven't looked for them. And we haven't looked for them because the Chinese produced them so efficiently that there was no incentive to look for them. Now that they have been, in effect, weaponized, they may begin to be priced at their strategic value rather than produced as against the cost to produce them. But a second thing that I think people need to concern themselves with rare earths, and Paul was good enough to include this in the letter, is that the cost of producing rare earths in China is rising fairly rapidly. The process by which rare earths were produced in China, and still in some circumstances are, is extremely environmentally destructive. And neither the Chinese people nor the Chinese Communist Party is likely to accept the incredible environmental degradation in Xinjiang that existed in the past, which means that the cost to produce in the lowest cost producer in the world in China is going up, which suggests that even cost-based pricing means that there will be substantial price escalations in rare earths. This may seem subtle, but it's crucially important. And the purpose of this newsletter and the purpose of opening up the discussions, the purpose of the boot camp that we did a year and a half ago, and the purpose of the ongoing discussions in the rural classroom that we've had with Dave Wargo, all have to do with equipping you, our students, to have a better understanding of the real investment and speculative parameters around critical materials.
Thank you, Rick. I want to sort of follow up on a couple of things you said. You pretty much started your comments by saying you're not a fan of the US government spending your tax dollars given to companies. That being the case, what should US government or any government do, for that matter, to stimulate the production of critical minerals? Where do you see the government, getting the biggest bang for taxpayer buck?
Streamlining regulation and perhaps streamlining the permitting process. I'm delighted to see, as an example, the United States government evidencing support for onshoring processes of rare earths, particularly in Louisiana. Had that not occurred, I would suspect that the permitting guideline for something like that would be 10 years or 12 years or 15 years. One thing that Mr. Trump could do very easily is lobby in southwestern Louisiana, where he's very popular politically, and with the Louisiana state government, in a way to streamline the permitting for rare earths and other material. Another thing that could be done specifically with regards to the United States would be to reform our tax code. Our tax code is populist and it's ludicrously weighted towards consumption. Paul, if you and I were to build a rare earth separation facility in China, and we were to use the typical method of construction, which is tilt-up concrete, in China, we would expense the construction of that plant against our income in year one, including other income that wasn't ring-fenced to that activity. In the United States, we would amortize that plant over 33 years at 3% a year. Even in socialist Sweden, you are allowed in many industrial applications to expense rather than amortize your upfront capital expenditures. If Mr. Trump wanted to do something for basic industries in the United States, the two things that he could do immediately would be to streamline the permitting and regulatory framework and change the US tax code so that the US tax code was competitive with other manufacturers and processors like Taiwan, China, Korea, Japan, Russia, and Sweden.
Okay. You mentioned permitting. Permitting is something that the Trump administration is looking to address, or not just looking to address, but is addressing. I had a conversation earlier today with Emily Dominic, who's the head of the Federal Permitting Council, and she was talking about all the things that the government or the Permitting Council is doing to coordinate permitting, federal permitting under the NEPA process and local state permitting, getting everybody at the table to reduce permitting times. And she said so far, They've shaved 25% of permitting times. Now we've got the government shutdown. She said 2 projects have been permitted in the last month during the government shutdown. They're well resourced. So I think we can expect to see more projects going into that process, in the Fast 41 process. And because of that, coming out the other side with a decision, negative, positive, in a much quicker timeline. In the Substack, in the newsletter, Rick, we commented on or reflected how the share prices of a lot of companies has increased. We're not just talking about going up 50%, not talking about going up 100%. A lot of companies in this space have got 1,000% gains. Some of the biggest gainers have 12,000% gains or 15,000% gains year on year. So I think this is, given that we're focusing on investment, this is a very good question in the feed. Given that how critical minerals company share prices have appreciated so much over the past year, what's the investment strategy? Is it best to sit tight and hope for a pullback, or suck it up and just get in?
The investment strategy on any single investment name is to put the company through the process that we've detailed ad nauseum in the real classroom. Price information is only useful if you can utilize it in the context of value. It's the delta between price and value, or price and expected value, that yields a positive or negative investment decision, at least for a successful investor. So merely the fact that the share price has gone up doesn't necessarily disqualify the investment. But without a point of view on the value of the company or the prospective value of the company, the price information is of no use. Conceptually, the price of a stock that has doubled with no change in the underlying fundamentals is precisely half as attractive as it was before the price increased. Conversely, if nothing has changed and the price falls by half, that company is precisely twice as attractive as it was before the price decreased. The message here is that the whole point of the discussion that we're having today, and the whole point of the boot camps that we've done, the whole point of Introduction to Natural Resource Investing, is that in addition to the price information, which is easy to obtain, we're trying to give our students access to the ability to value these deposits. And that's what's important. When people say to me, Rick, the price of something has gone from 10 cents to $1.20. It's up 1,200%. I said, yeah, that's interesting, but that information isn't useful to me. I can read. What do you think it's worth? What's changed? How many shares are outstanding? Very often, people will quote prices to me without knowing the number of shares that are outstanding, or without knowing how much cash is in the treasury, or without knowing how much debt is in the treasury. This slavish focus on price to the exclusion of other variables that are much more important to me is precisely what we're arguing against here at Rural Classroom. We have attempted, as an example, to introduce people to meteoric resources, not as an investment per se, although I've invested in them, but rather as a subject for study. What is the size of the deposit? What is the grade of the deposit? What are the potential processing options? What about the sociology and the politics of the region? How will the material be processed? Who will it be sold to? What will the likely cost of capital be? What will the fiscal regime be? Understanding how to answer all those questions is actually much more important to people than the share price of meteoric.
Okay. Now, Rick, in your comments a moment ago, when you were talking about alpha-min and tin production in Democratic Republic of Congo, you made a sort of throwaway remark about potential localized military conflict. And there was some of that early this year. The company had to suspend operations for a while. Given one of the drivers to the critical minerals subject is the increasing global geopolitical fragmentation, perhaps forming blocks again, one can cast one's mind back to the Cold War and the political blocks that opened up then, proxy wars, competition for resources, etc., etc. We're seeing the export and import of different minerals being restricted or having further sort of non-tariff trade barriers placed on them. Is the critical mineral space going into a situation or a scenario where, you know, the competition between the different blocks for these resources could get physical?
Oh, I think absolutely. Absolutely, positively. If a deposit is in a frontier nation that's allegedly non-aligned, but also unstable, like Congo, it makes absolute sense to me that the losers would attempt to instigate at least localized political instability, uh, if not to change that decision, even out of envy and spite. Um, I mean, it makes absolute sense to me that that would occur. And there's a long history in resource development of that having occurred. Companies that have been unsuccessful in securing exploration credits in the oil and gas business have often gone as far as regime change. Witness the United States and Iran. So there's a long, and I wouldn't say proud, a long and sordid history around exacerbating local political instabilities. That said, Paul, I am a big fan of the idea that you buy a high quality deposit in what is perceived to be a low quality country rather than buying a low quality deposit in a high quality country. The truth is that if you have an asset that's worth stealing, and there's very few of those, at least in the beginning, you have a good asset. There are going to be a lot of strategic material assets in the United States that will never produce, that will be funded because they are strategic material assets in a jurisdiction that Americans at least are comfortable with. So I think it's very important that you understand that this is a multivariable decision. But I would suggest that quality of management and quality deposits are the first of the variables that you consider.
Okay, and one aspect of the quality of management is their ability to manage local relationships and hopefully keep everybody happy so they can continue executing their plan. An example of that perhaps coming out today is Mali, where news has come out that the government is looking to cancel, I think 90%, 80% of exploration permits. A lot of companies present in Mali have seen their shell sell down today, B2Gold, for example. Rick, that's a situation where clearly something has changed. When you look at something like that, when you read something like that, when you become aware of something like that, what process do you go through to incorporate that new information into the sort of...
I normally sell first and ask questions later, unless the unaffected assets that the company has in that jurisdiction are valuable enough to carry them. I am very much, Paul, of the view that if the reason that you own a stock goes away, the stock has to go away too. And if one of the reasons that you owned a stock had to do with exploration upside that you perceived in Mali, a jurisdiction that looks like for the 3 to 5 year time frame, it's going to be a lousy jurisdiction for exploration, that you need to lose the stock. And you need to lose the stock irrespective of whether you're down 30% or 35% or up 15%. When the reason to own a stock goes away, I believe the stock absolutely has to go away. It becomes a much trickier equation if you're looking at somebody like B2, with fairly large exploration concessions, but also with very valuable existing operations. And at least theoretically, a company that has already had the fiscal negotiations with the Malian government over their existing assets. It becomes much, much, much more difficult then. And that requires a lot of iterative work, discussions with the company, and the valuations as an example of their non-Malian assets.
Okay. Looking at I think we've addressed all the sort of questions that are in the comments. There's a lot of questions in general about other stocks, which I know, Rick, you do a Q&A specifically to take questions, any kind of questions. So please direct your questions to Rick during that occasion. But one thing, I'm going to step out of left field, given the subject matter we're talking about today, and talk about, to ask Rick's comments on a transaction that was announced this morning in the gold space. And that, of course, is Mexico's precious metals leader, Fresnillo, moving into Canada's Abitibi district with a what is it, $600 or $700 million acquisition of Probe Gold. Now, interesting thing here, the Abitibi is pretty much Agnico Eagle's mine's backyard, front yard. It's got its main house there. What would you make of this, Rick?
It's tough to say. Maybe it's an indication that we're into silly season now. Maybe we're starting to see acquisitions that take place because people can. I would have expected more discipline. Probe is a company I know reasonably well. It's a very large but low-grade deposit. Even at current gold prices, the return on capital employed, giving fairly high upfront capital costs, are going to be pretty high. You and I talked, Paul, in the context of a previous letter that you wrote about how my view of the Abitibi has changed as a consequence of my visit with Amar Al-Jundi, the CEO of Agnico Eagle, who said that deposits in the Abitibi that have traditionally been stranded deposits, because they couldn't make hurdle rate economics work, would be economic this cycle because there's so much infrastructure in the Abitibi that these deposits could be bought and mined and processed at existing mills, leveraging existing infrastructure. But Fresnillo doesn't have that advantage. Fresnillo has no existing infrastructure. This is by definition a greenfield project. It could also be, in addition to being merely stupid, it could be a function of Fresnillo looking at their strained relationship with the current political administration in Mexico, and the fact that there's an expressed dislike by the president of Mexico of the controlling families of Peñoles, who are in turn the controlling shareholders in Fresnillo. In other words, it could be that the management team ultimately in charge of Fresnillo believes that political diversity is a necessity given the vagaries of their own political climate. That said, I would have expected the acquirer to be somebody like Eldorado or IM Gold or Agnico Eagle, that is to say, somebody that either was or expected to be a consolidator in the Abitibi. Fresnillo was just absolutely out of left field for me.
Absolutely, yeah. We can add to that list Wesdome Gold Mines there in the producing in the Abitibi as well. Now, I think one, many interesting aspects to this. Fresno coming out of Mexico, they're in Peru, they're in Chile, but coming into North America, that seems to be a statement of intent. They want to get active in the North American space. But it's interesting as well because they passed up the ability to acquire the 44% stake in Juanicipio that it didn't own, and somebody else came in and bought that. So, and that's arguably one of the best silver deposits, one of the best silver mines in the world. He chose not to do that. He said it's going into a gold exploration company, a greenfield project in the Abitibi. There's a number of other family, let's say family precious metals companies in Latin America. Do you expect, having seen this, do you expect some of the others to follow a similar track?
I guess if the market allows them, yes. It's ironic to me. The North American companies enjoy a lower cost of capital than the Latin American companies. So the Latin American companies have chosen, in this circumstance, to go from an area where they have expertise and scale into an area where they have neither, and where their cost of capital is higher than their competitors. It's a real head scratcher to me. Maybe political risk in Mexico and Peru is even higher than I perceive it as being. Or maybe these companies believe that if they operate in Canada, that they can lower their cost of capital. I don't know. From a competitive viewpoint, it's inexplicable to me. The idea
Okay.
you appreciate the leverage, the knowledge leverage you have in your home market. You compete in somebody else's home market, and the people you compete with have a cost of capital advantage is just inexplicable to me. Until I get better color on it, I'm just going to suggest that this is a replay of the decade 2000 to 2010, where the mining industry made so many catastrophic investment allocation mistakes.
Okay, and Fresnillo is paying a 39% premium there. It's an all-cash deal. And I'd like to sort of reflect back to our previous issue was about silver. We talked briefly about Fresnillo and a couple of the other Latin American companies. And I think this highlights one of the additional factors that these essentially family-run companies have, which can result in things coming up which are, in your words, Rick, sort of beggar belief. Okay, I think we're sort of coming to the...
I didn't get around to it, but I will Monday sell my Fresnillo. I was too busy today, which is an example of how busy I am and how stupid I am. But when the reason to own a stock goes away, the stock goes away. I had regarded Fresnillo as the premier silver producer in Mexico. And I saw them incorrectly, I think, as being concerned about per share accretion and value. I think that they thought that the purchase of MAG would be dilutive on a per share basis to them. Rather than buying in the remaining minority interest in what is arguably the best silver mine in the world, they've chosen to go into a jurisdiction where they have no definable competitive advantage, into an asset that they know less well, competing against people with a lower cost of capital. That is sufficient reason for me to sell my existing shareholding in both Fresnillo and
I don't have the mass at hand, but I imagine the money they're paying to buy Probe, the money they'll have to invest in CapEx to build it is going to be considerably above what that 44% of one of MAG Silver sold for. I think we're pretty much coming to the end of our time here. So, Rick, let me sort of conclude by saying, thank you very much for participating. Thank you for sharing your insights into the critical mineral space and into a couple of transactions and news bits that have come out just in the past day or so. Our next issue, as I mentioned at the top, is going to be on critical minerals for the energy sector. So we're looking at copper, we're looking at graphite, we're looking at uranium, and there's another one which slips my mind for the moment. So that'll be coming in late November, towards the end of November. So stay tuned for that. Rick, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. And the audience should remember another political implication around uranium, a suggestion that Brookfield, Cameco, and the U.S. taxpayer will collectively spend $80 billion on new nuclear plant construction in the United States, which, if it were to occur, I think would have profound implications for what is already going to be a tight uranium market. So I think our readers will look forward to this next issue with the same interest that they have shown this issue. Congratulations again.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, lithium's the other one, the other mineral we'll be looking at as well. So stay tuned and we'll see you next month.